Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another election special for the constituency of Watford, which is brewing up to be a very hotly contested seat indeed. Today, I've got Aidan Cottrell-Boyce with me. He's joining us on behalf of the Green Party. So come and say hello, Aidan.
Hi, Chris. How are you? Hello, everybody.
Hi, Aidan. Yeah, it wasn't too long ago that we had our previous interview. So this is a second bite of the cherry, so to speak. It's getting incredibly close to the election. We're here on a Monday. It's this Thursday, so I suspect you're absolutely flying about everywhere, aren't you?
Yeah, I have. I've been out on the doorstep this morning, just ran back, had a piece of toast and got myself in position to start the interview, but it's pretty haywire.
Fantastic. I was speaking with one of the other candidates earlier, and we were just talking about the hustings. I can't remember there ever being so much conversation and so much engagement, and it might be because I'm more aware of it, but there is a huge amount of interest, especially in Watford. Have you found that?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said that I thought it was going to be as hard work as it's turned out to be. I think we've had 11 or 12 hustings, over the space of about I don't know, less than 3 weeks. So it's been absolutely manic. I think it's the nature of the seats, and I guess the nature of the election as well, that it's so marginal, it's so tight that everybody's, and also that some of the other parties apart from Labour and the Conservatives are coming to the fore a bit more. That there seems to be a few more ideas knocking around, a bit more imagination, a few more alternatives being discussed. Yeah, so it's really blown me away.
What's it been like going around doing these hustings? Because you must. Someone said it's a bit like a pop group. You kind of just go around doing these other things.
Yeah, it is strange. It is. I've got to say, it is one of the most sort of, I don't know, intellectually grueling things I've ever had to do. It's just sitting there, and you're waiting for somebody to ask you a question. You don't know whether it's going to be about, the road that goes past their house, or the NHS, or Syria, and it's just, you've got to think on the spot, and it's really tough. But it is funny, that thing about spending so much time with your rivals, so to speak. That you get to know each other quite well, and it's quite heartening in a way, that you come to realize that whatever people's political persuasions, generally speaking, they're not, these kind of diabolical forces. They're just, people who have different ideas but who generally have the sort of best interests of the electorate at heart. Maybe that's not the most maybe that's not the best thing for me to say, but it is true. Most people generally want the best for the country, but they just have different ideas about how it can be done.
And has any of the hustings in particular sort of stuck in your mind as kind of, wow, that was a tough gig?
Yeah, well, the one at Queen's was the audience was a lot younger, and it was a bit more sort of tempestuous. It was really good, but that's what you want, really. You want a lot of participation from the audience and people being opinionated and stuff. Some of the others have been a bit quieter, which I guess has its role as well, but it's a bit more exciting when you've got people with, who are a bit more forthright about their opinions, I guess.
And where have you been out and about campaigning? Because I've had conflicting views on how many households there are in the Watford area. I think someone said 28,000, someone said 52 or 56. Obviously, it's a huge area. You were quite, you were appointed as the candidate quite late, so it must be incredibly fast and furious. But where have you been out and about? Which parts of Watford?
I've literally covered every sort of blade of grass in Watford. I think probably, been in Oxley and Abbots Langley, and really genuinely all over the place. So it has been very, physically exhausting as well, but it's good. It's good to get out about.
You lost weight with all this walking?
I think I have. I think I've lost a few pounds, but I'll probably put them back on again as soon as I get back to.
So, out and about on the streets, knocking on doors, are people aware of what the Green Party stands for? That's the first thing I kind of, are they aware? Are they up to date? Is it because I mean, before I've spoken to people, it's like, oh yeah, it's all about Greenham Common and you know, and ban the bomb and all this kind of stuff. But are people more aware of what you stand for these days?
Oh, I think undeniably that it's the green agenda is quite, you know, quite visible, and people are very, you know, much more aware of it than I ever remember, you know, having been outside of the Green Party in the past. So like I was talking to somebody, and at the last election, I was a student, and I was living in a student house, and it was a divided house. You know, so there was the Labour camp in the house, a few Tories in the house, and I remember one of them. It was quite, tempers quite frayed, and one of them said, "Oh, I'll vote Green," you know, just as a kind of neutral thing. And I remember thinking back then that it was just seemed like such a left field thing to do, whereas now, just talking about my sort of social circle and things, I would say, obviously it's not particularly scientific, but I would say probably a majority of people in my sort of social circle are either definitely going to vote Green or considering voting Green. So it's just become an option now, and I guess that's partly to do with the fact of it being, you know, this terminal decline of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in terms of their share of the popular vote. It's just people are aware now that it's not a straight choice between the two, you know.
Has there been sort of something that's come up fairly regularly when you've got into a discussion with people that's kind of seems to be something that's kind of got their attention?
I think probably, I don't know, I haven't seen your other interviews with the other candidates, but I guess they would probably agree that it's the NHS. Like all anybody, well, not all anybody ever talks about, but it's disproportionately people want to talk about the NHS and the future of the NHS. And I think there's a misconception with a lot of people that Labour are going to stop the privatisation of the NHS for some reason. And I think it's kind of a miracle that Labour have been able to sell that line, because it's patently not true. You know, Labour started the process of privatising the NHS, and you know, they're standing on a platform of continuing, you know, with you know, they're perfectly happy for 5% of the profit, you know, companies to make 5% profits on private contracts with the NHS. So I think it's important, because people are so passionate about it and people are so keen that the NHS stays in public hands, free at the point of delivery. I think it's important for those of us who share that opinion to make sure that people know that that's not what Labour is planning to do if they get into government. Yeah, because I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make.
It is interesting. I remember seeing your interview with the BBC at the top of the town, and you were asked the question about, is it a wasted vote to vote Green in terms of the overall mix of things? Have you found that people on the doorstep are less stuck in their ways about which way they're going to vote, and they have got more of a propensity to change if they hear the right kind of noises from the different parties?
Yeah, and again, I guess it comes back to the last election, when people started to realise that you weren't going to have these big majorities anymore, and people are starting to think, okay, well, it's not just like a boxing match. It's not a zero-sum game where I choose either red or blue. You've got to, and when that reality becomes obvious, then you start thinking, as a voter, you've got to start thinking, okay, well, who's the party that best represents my point of view? You know, what are the policies? And I think you're probably right. This is probably going to be a more issues-driven election than any that we've had for a long time, really. And it seems strange, because people think of it as quite a post-ideological political landscape in terms of the opposition between Labour and Tory. But when you've got such a broad sort of palette of parties to choose from, then people do actually engage a bit more in, okay, there's various different options. I think it's really interesting, that thing is, sorry for rambling on a little bit, but I think it's interesting being at the Hustings and nationally, the way the Lib Dems in particular have situated themselves as, you know, the happy medium, the sensible party, because they're in between the two poles, which are represented by the Labour and the Conservatives. And you think, well, those poles are only arbitrarily decided by people within those parties. You know, that's not something which is, they're not really two ideological extremes. they're very close together. Do you know what I mean? So saying we're in the middle of these two ideological, well, you're not. You're just in the middle of two arbitrarily decided manifestos, and all of which are sort of committed to neoliberal economics. So anyway.
I mean, and they are. I mean, like you've almost got just a collection of people in the centre ground now. It's nice, like you say. There's almost. I mean, there's a few things that are different, of course, but it's almost like very little difference.
Yeah.
Whereas, excuse me, in the old days, Michael Foot, Ted Heath, they were kind of polar opposites. But those days are over. What about austerity? Have you heard much on the street about? I know we had a conversation last time on the last interview when you were saying, this obsession with paying down the debt. It's almost been like hoodwinking, a bit of hoodwinking of the electorate, really, because it's not quite what it seems. And I read an article this morning which is basically saying that actually this whole debt, paying it down, austerity is just one big lie, really.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few people who come out and say, Mervyn King has said, deficit spending doesn't have any discernible detrimental impact on the economy as a whole. But I think that the conversation isn't really about, you have a lot of people talking about debt is deferred taxation and stuff. And I think what people don't really talk about is that austerity is obviously deferred taxation. When you put 140,000 children in poverty, when those children grow up, going to have a particular set of needs that the state is going to have to address, whether that's policing or education or social work or mental health issues or all of the rest of it. So it's about having a much more nuanced and a much more long-sighted picture. There seems to be, particularly from the Tory party line, but also from the Labour Party, a sense that you can put public spending on hold, and then when prosperity comes back, then you can reinvest in and pick up from where you left off. And it's really, from my point of view, I think that's just staggeringly naive to think that you're going to slash all this public spending, slash all these public services, and people are just going to sort of wait in stasis. This is causing gigantic problems which the next generation is going to have to address. I think it's just really, really, really short-sighted.
Yeah, one of the other things. I mean, I get out and about a bit, as you well know. One of the other things that I often speak with younger people about is how on earth am I going to get on the housing ladder? Now, as we know, in the UK, we've got this obsession with owning our own houses, which is not necessarily reflected in the rest of Europe, but it's definitely something that we've got here in the UK. But the average age of someone being able to buy their house now being 37 or thereabouts, this is a huge problem. We just need to solve this with some affordable, with the housing, with the buy to let and the landlord and the rents going out of control as well. It's just a real problem for young people, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's so frustrating. As I guess I classify myself as a young person. I think it's so frustrating for most people in the run-up to the election, the way there's, you don't want to say mendacity, but such a disingenuous conversation going on between all three main political parties about housing. All three parties saying, oh, they're so committed to housing, and you just feel like there's been zero appetite to address that in the past 20 or 30 years when these parties have been in control. So it's kind of a strange landscape, when you have all these people saying how urgent the housing crisis is, and you think, well, why haven't you done anything about it? And the reality is they haven't done anything about it because one of the only things that we do in this economy which produces growth is buy and sell houses to each other, and buy and sell, and particularly property speculators. For the Conservative Party in particular, this is one of the things that needs to be stimulated all the time, property speculation, because it's something that provides growth. But it's something which provides growth massively to the detriment of 99% of the population. So it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think particularly social housing. I think I read somewhere that it's the first time ever that the Labour Party hasn't mentioned social housing in its manifesto. They've talked about building affordable homes. There's no mention of building social housing. And when you think about how costly it is to have a shortage of social housing to the taxpayer, You know, when the taxpayer is literally forking out money, not to benefit claimants, but to private landlords, you know, which itself has a massively inflationary, I think we were talking about this last time maybe, but has a massively inflationary effect on rental prices. You know, because the landlords think, well, the government's just going to pay me whatever I charge, so I can charge whatever I want, and that just drags rents up. So it's just a unbelievably vicious cycle that could be solved if you built social housing, which the Green Party is talking about, 500,000 new homes, which would itself create 35,000 jobs. So it just seems like such a no-brainer, and the only thing which stops people from engaging with it is this fixation with growth in the market. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying for a while that the housing sector is got a real problem because prices are obviously out of control,
Yeah.
but the people that can afford to buy multiple properties at advantageous interest rates are basically stitching up the remainder of the market. And what we really need is a whole batch of housing which is outside of the market forces, which is social housing.
Which is social housing, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, and also there's a whole range of advantages. You know, in terms of having this is the thing. You know, when you pare back, social security to the extent that it's only the poorest of the poorest of the poorest who get anything out of it, and then you create a situation where you have this huge cultural shift by the middle class. You know, of anger against the people who are benefit claimants. What we should be looking at is having more and more people, across the spectrum, participating in social security. You know, living in social housing and that kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? It shouldn't just be like for the very, very, very poorest. We should have enough to lift that into a kind of a normal way of living. And also, there's massive advantages to that, because you think about it. If you have a landlord, who are they? Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of the time, there's fairly rapacious kind of with their rates and elusive and all the rest of it. How great would it be if more people had landlords who were democratically accountable? And which is what a lot of European countries have a lot more sorts of. It's just a normal thing to have social housing.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually, in terms of housing, I think what we've got are landlords who want to make a profit. What we want are landlords who want to provide a home.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, if you have more accountable people, that's the way to do it. So I think what the Green Party is talking about is really helpful in that way, because they're talking about, again, this is completely antithetical to anything that you would find with the Labour Party or with the Conservative Party. But they're talking about ways that we can de-incentivize property speculation. And if you're a Tory, you think, well, God, we don't want to do that because property speculation increases growth. But for all the reasons that you're talking about, the scale of positive versus negative, pros versus cons for having a really, really ferocious property speculation market, the negatives massively outweigh the positives for the 99% of the population. So if you introduce measures to disincentivize that as a way of producing capital, then it's in the long term massively favorable for tenants rather than for landlords.
Yeah, you touched on the fact that effectively, because of the high rents and people can't afford them, that essentially the taxpayer is almost like subsidizing the landlord because they can charge what they like. And that whole issue of how does the government, or how is our tax, if you like, spent, I had conversations with people who say, if tax is at 45 pence in the pound, which is what it is pretty much, and we're paying that 45 pence in the pound to an overhead, which is what government is, then ultimately, either it would be great if they, I think it's not that the fact that the tax is high, it's that it's been irresponsibly used. Yeah. And I think that's the bit that annoys people.
Yeah. Well, it's irresponsibly used and ineffectively collected is the other thing, So if you have tax being collected effectively, then the sort of burden of taxation for the entire population would fall, because, as everybody knows, this is an issue across the political spectrum. There's a class of people in this country who are enormously wealthy, who have enormous amounts of unearned, untaxed, and unproductive wealth. whether it's inherited or whether it comes just from speculation, they don't spend it and they don't pay tax on it. So it's about making sure that's a privilege that this country can't afford. That's having those reservoirs of cash at the top of our society that the taxpayer is constantly subsidizing. It's just such a white elephant. It's such a luxury that we've bought, with our work, that we shouldn't have any. We can't afford anymore,
And I was talking, I think, one of the other candidates, and we were talking about about zero contract hours, about the issues around those, but also about people coming out on apprenticeships, and the apprenticeship schemes being abused by large businesses who basically consume the apprentice hours for 3 months or whatever it is, and then they just dispose of them, and then they get the next batch in. Yeah. And ultimately what they're doing is paying £3 an hour, which is, and we are then subsidizing these businesses by topping up their benefits. Now, the other side of that is, well, if we made these people pay their taxes and, we encourage them to provide decent work, then, that problem could be solved another way. But you've got to educate businesses to do that, and or you could stop them from abusing the system. But, it doesn't seem right that these people are effectively having their work, they're not paying for their workforce, we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think apprenticeships is a really interesting one, because it's completely untouchable for the main political parties, because it's such a nice, a positive buzzword kind of thing, that we're for apprenticeship, and Labour have said it, and the Conservatives have said it. I think it's something that definitely needs looking at, along with workfare and all these kind of measures that the government has introduced, basically, again, to subsidise big businesses and give them free labour. I think, I mean, again, you get the impression that we're sort of protecting the wrong people there. Do you know what I mean? And the reality is, on a social level, when you think about it, massively disproportionately, the people who are losing out because of these schemes are the people who are poor. Because if you're from a wealthy family, you're not going on workfare, you're not going to, going on these apprenticeships or whatever. It's only if you come from a poor background, and it is trapping people in poverty. Which is an irony, because it's sold as this way of lifting people out of poverty with training and all the rest of it, and a carrot and stick and all. But really, what it's doing is miring people more and more in poverty, I think, when you have those kind of measures.
I was watching a very brief, I think it was one of the recordings, I think it might be Watford Grammar School husting, and people were talking about tuition fees there. What has that come up much, the issue about tuition fees?
Yeah, it has, and I think it's a weird one, just strategically for the Labour Party, I guess, that they've tried to position themselves as the party which is on the left in terms of tuition fees, but it's unsellable, right? Because they introduced tuition fees, and they're talking about reducing them to £6,000 a year, which is still unbelievably high compared to most European countries. I think that a conversation that I was having with a number of people was how, again, and this ties in with the last thing that we were talking about in terms of apprenticeships and workfare and sanctions and stuff. When you think about our country at the moment, a huge percentage of the job market is taken up with jobs that require degrees. So when you're talking about a lot of the good jobs in this country, the jobs that don't pay minimum wage, then you're talking about jobs that you need a degree to get. So if you're saying to people, you need to fork out 45 grand or whatever it is in order to get this piece of paper which allows you to work in this country, which allows you to get a job in this country, that is profoundly undemocratic as far as I'm concerned. And I was talking to Richard Harrington. He was sort of coming up with this argument, which I've heard a few people say about when he was at university and there wasn't fee, and he felt bad because there were working class people who were subsidizing his education as a middle class person. And I just thought, that is such a non-argument. If that's the basis, that one of our elected officials is going into Parliament and making decisions about tuition fees, it's such a completely ersatz argument, because all you're saying is it's taken too long for the culture to change, and so we're just being incredibly impatient about how long this culture is changing. And so what we're going to do is saddle saddle the people who you were worried about being taxed to pay for your education with tens of thousands of pounds worth of debts, because that's fairer. It just seems like a nonsense argument to me, and I found that really dispiriting, really worrying.
I mean, another argument I've heard about the whole tuition fee thing is that, it's a serious decision to make. It's a serious decision whether you go to university or not. I decided not to go to university, but it was a decision because I had a university place. But I decided that it wasn't the best choice for me at the time, because I was fairly comfortable. I wanted to get into computers and I'd got a job in the computers. So I just decided. But it's almost like, there is a sense amongst certain people, and I'm not saying who, it could be, that people believe now that it's a rite of passage almost to go to university. It's like, it's there, I want to do it, and I'm not quite sure what I want to do, so give me a chance to find out. And it's almost like, well, the idea that that university in the old days was there for people who wanted to be an architect, an engineer, or a doctor, or a vet, or a lawyer, or a barrister, or whatever. It required further education. It required more study. There was no doubt about that. But now it's almost like it's open to everybody. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's like there are lots of people probably going to university that shouldn't really be going to university, because it's another view. Isn't it?
No, I think there's probably an argument to be had. I think partly, we've monetized education so much in this country that you do obviously have these places that have set up that do function as just degree shops, and they offer a very low standard of education, and they offer courses which don't help people to get a job, which is obviously not the be all and end all of education, but for whatever, they're not offering a good standard of education either, and they soak the students for thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. So I don't think that's a good thing, and I completely see that argument, and I think we could have a conversation on a political level, on a cultural level, about what universities are for. As somebody who works in university and who works in education, I think that's a very valuable conversation to have. But just saying, let's have this very punitive tax on all higher education, that just seems like a really short-sighted and kind of like scattergun approach to having that conversation. Let's just say, there's lots of degrees. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but they're all going to be inordinately expensive, and so some people will choose not to. That just doesn't seem like a good way of doing it, of achieving what you want to achieve, which is a good education sector.
I would concur that it's a bit of a blunt instrument.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just like
immigration. I'm sure on your travels this has come up in conversation.
Sure.
What's Watford is well, since way before I can remember, has always been a very open and cosmopolitan town. We've had people from waves of people from different parts of the world coming to Watford, and actually it's quite diverse, the culture here. But is this a major issue for people? Are people talking about this?
I was actually struck by how, generally speaking, and I was talking to Dorothy Thornhill about this as well, how generally speaking, the kind of paranoia that the right-wing populist kind of press talks about in terms of immigration, I really genuinely haven't found in on the campaign trail, I guess you call it. But going around talking to people at Hustings and stuff, 95% of people and all the candidates as well, to varying degrees, have said they understand the values of the value of immigration, how important immigration is to this country. And I think it's really interesting when you look at, say, just for argument's sake, take UKIP. When you look at the fertile ground for the UKIP votes, it's almost always in constituencies where there's almost no immigration, right? So these little towns on the East Coast and places like that, and in Essex. And I'm not doing those people down, because I think it's an informative way of looking at the debate, because what comes across is the fact that people who are anxious about immigration, generally speaking, are people who've had very little experience of immigration firsthand. And people who live in Watford or who live in major city, the major cities of the country, who have had lots of first-hand experience of immigration, generally speaking, are aware that it's pretty much a positive thing, and it's a fraught subject, and there's obviously lots of issues that surround it that make it very complicated. But generally speaking, the anxiety about change, the anxiety about culture, the anxiety about things comes from people who don't have so much first-hand experience of it, in my experience. And I think this sort of statistical things about people who vote for UKIP and things like that has borne that out a little bit.
I think the point, a good point you made there, is people who don't have experience or don't know. And of course, if you don't know something, then there is a fear of that thing, or a fear of change. I think one of the biggest issues that we've probably got here is that we just don't actually know who's coming in and out of the country. It needs to be. I'm not saying we need to stop anybody, but we just need to count people.
I don't want to. That's just an issue again of underfunding public services, isn't it? Really, just making sure that the bodies, because it's not like we don't have bodies in place which are tasked with that job, which are tasked with that role. It's just that they're clearly, I can't pretend to be an expert on it, but clearly they're not funded well enough if they can't do their job to a sufficient standard. I think it's interesting what you're saying about how it's not just saying there are areas of the country which don't have have very high proportion of white British people, where you find the biggest proportion of UKIP voters. But it's also, when you look back into history, when in the 1960s and 1970s, nationally there was a lot more pessimism and a lot more anxiety about immigration, at a point when immigration was, compared to now, very, very low. And I read somewhere a statistic that said 70%, or something like 70% of the population in 1970 believed that Britain was swamped with immigration, and that was actually a point in our history when we were a net contribute. We were losing people. Net
exporter,
exporter of people. So it's kind of fascinating the way those anxieties always come to the surface, regardless of whether they're based in fact or not.
So, do you think in this election? I mean, I know that there has been in previous elections a measure of tactical voting, but do you sense that actually, with kind of the end of two-party politics, really, and the fact that we are going to probably end up with a much broader spread of people with different views? That sounds like a democracy. With a broader spread of views being able to influence policy going forwards, that perhaps the days of tactical voting are coming to an end, and that people, as you've said before in other interviews, that people say, well, do you know what, I'm just going to vote with what I think's right.
Yeah. I mean, I think the logic of it is beginning to fall apart, because I think the logic of tactical voting essentially is to make sure either that Labour wins or that the Conservative wins, but neither of them are going to get a majority. So the logic of the arguments for tactical voting, I think, are beginning to disintegrate a little bit. And exactly as you say, maybe it's idealistic, but I think people are starting to vote a bit more for what they believe in, and maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know, because a lot of people I've seen, in Watford and all around, a big generation gap between people who are saying, my mum is voting or my dad's voting Labour to keep the Tories out, but I'm voting Green. And I think that's a sign of the things to come, that kind of duopoly mentality it hasn't filtered through to this generation in the way that it did in previous generations.
So we're getting close to the election. What have you got planned between now and Thursday?
I've got a few different things. I'll obviously be out and about in Watford, knocking on doors and leafleting and things. I'm going to speak to sixth formers at St Michael's Catholic School in Garston, and God, there must be a couple of other things that have slipped my mind. But the main thing, I guess, is the count, which I'm excited about, but also slightly daunted by, because I think some of the whatever the independent body that decides these things said that the results from Watford are going to come in at about 6 in the morning. So that's going to be a long night, but you know, it'll be exciting. It'll be very exciting.
So where is the count actually taking place?
That's a good question. It's gone. I've got it written down somewhere, but it's gone from. I don't know off the top of my head. That's really terrible, isn't it? I better check that out before the
yeah.
Or maybe not. You know, maybe that's a good reason not to
go. So, what's the outcome in Watford going to be? What do you think?
Green. Maybe a Green MP. I don't know. You know, it's very, very, very difficult to call. And I'm sure I'm sort of slipping into that politician role now, and I've been giving you very non-committal answers. But I honestly, genuinely don't know. And I'm sure that's what all the, well, maybe the other candidates are going to be a bit more forthright, but I don't know.
Do you think we'll get into recount territory?
It's a possibility, I think, yeah, because it is so tight, isn't it? The one thing that we can be certain of in Watford and nationally, I think, is that it's going to be incredibly tight.
Fantastic. Well, we'll draw it to a close here now, but thanks for sparing some time on Bank Holiday Monday afternoon. I guess holiday time is a bit of a distant memory at the moment.
Yeah, no, I didn't even register really that it was a bank holiday, to be honest.
Well, they're all out in Watford celebrating the parade.
I know the parade, isn't it? Yeah. So you're not there yourself, Chris. What time does it get into Watford?
I think it started at 2. It started at Asda's, and they kind of slowly drove up St Albans Road, and I think they're in the park now. But I feel a little bit of a fraud if I go down there, because I don't really support football.
Oh right, okay.
Sort of just revel in the good time seems a little bit fraudulent to me.
Well, it was funny. I was in Watford Town Centre on Saturday, and it was all, you know, really jumping. It was fantastic, but I think the politicians who were out canvassing and glad handing looked a little bit lost, you know, in the sort of like great massive gold scarves. So so that was a day off for politics for a lot of people on Saturday.
I think so. Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us, and I wish you all the best for Thursday, and good luck with the rest of the campaign, and no doubt we'll catch up with you afterwards for some comments.
Great, Chris. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Take care now. You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye then.